guys have already met Mark and Eleanor. Thanks for dropping by, so to speak. Very naturally, as we're gathered here having a cuppa together, having a chat. You have already met the group. They've already met you, talking about the sociological imagination. You introduced your work there, but just as a quick reminder, what have you been doing lately in the social research field?
So I conducted ethnographic research. I basically hung out with the people in the Perth hardcore punk scene to ground some grand theories of modernity, and I focused on these individuals' sense of order and then concomitantly the society that's structured that kind of logic that...
Who's the group again? Who are you
The
with?
Perth hardcore punk scene.
And what's that?
So sort of like a youth music scene based around this sort of thick punk sounding music, but it hasn't got that political stance or anti-mainstream kind of vibe that maybe punk of the past may have had. It's quite an everyday, very normal activity for them to go to these shows, hang out, listen to some music, talk to each other.
Right.
Yeah.
Isn't that a betrayal of the punk scene of the past? Like, they were politically active. They would have hated to be mainstream. That's probably the worst thing to tell.
I think, well, I don't think they'd like to be called mainstream, but it's far more of an everyday activity because they're middle class youth. Mm-hmm. They're not these working class people fighting for the power, you know, trying to do something great. They're just there to listen to the music, hang out with each other and have a good time. Like, it's a way to pass time rather than a way to be political. Yeah.
Mark, what have you been up to?
Well, I also hung out with people, but a different group. I did interviews, semi-structured interviews and ethnographic research among expatriate professionals, mainly heritage workers who work in the Pilbara. And they come from English-speaking countries, which have a bit of an economic crisis at the moment.
And heritage workers? What do you mean? Where? What?
The mining industry at the moment is booming in Australia, and what that means is they want to expand their mines, they build railways, and the Heritage Act, the original Heritage Act in Australia, forces them or compels them to do ethnographic and archaeological surveys before they destroy Aboriginal country. And there comes the anthropologists and the archaeologists in, and they do surveys.
And they're coming from all over the world, or particularly the English-speaking world?
Particularly the English-speaking world. It's basically a language barrier there. They would probably take French archaeologists as well. They wouldn't care too much.
So they've landed here in Western Australia?
They landed in Perth and just got a flat, and it is basically the same because they're just here to work. They're sent up to the Pilbara. So Pilbara is in the northwest, 1,200 kilometers northwest of Perth, which is on the west coast of Australia. And that's where we are at the moment. And yeah, they're just completely disconnected with their former life. They're still archaeologists, and but their life is completely in flux. They don't really have got any connection to place anymore. Mm-hmm. They are pushed around by structures which is completely beyond their control.
Mark, sociology and structures and social change. Really, I think it would be fair to say that you're both focused in on social change in some way. I've been talking to the group. We're focused this week on issues of modernity, post-modernity, the adequacy of those terms for describing the times we're in. How would you describe, how would you start to conceptualise the contemporary world out of the work you've been doing?
Well, I've been looking at all these theories that call it a late modernity, a reflexive modernity, a liquid modernity, a second modernity. There's all these terms, but it seems to be far more nuanced than any of those terms can provide. But I kind of stuck with that idea of it being a liquid modernity, so one that's fluid, flexible, highly individualised. And it also entails this expectation of these individuals to become makers of themselves. So to make these choices themselves, they have a really big responsibility to choose and select both identity and community and other facets.
Where's that pressure coming from?
I think it's just coming from what Bauman would say is this disintegration of social structures. So all these things are changing, and of course if we go back to sort of that Bourdieuian idea of habitus, you know, and social structure, choice.
Because with this class, we're not going back, we're going forward to that later.
Well, I still find him quite useful. So you've got this idea that society is structuring these individuals' logic, and if these structures of the past that may have been like, you're working class, you're going to go to work in this job for this long, and
So you're going to go work in a factory somewhere.
Exactly. And then maybe you want to get involved in punk because you hate the factory or something like that. But it's this idea that it's far more fluid and flexible now, and people have far more choice because resources are so highly dispersed all over the globe. They can make these choices, but there's so many choices, which one do they make? And that's sort of where that pressure comes from, to make the right choices and to not hold on to anything for too long in case a better choice comes along.
Okay. Hold those thoughts a bit. We might come back and see what you think of the idea of post-modernity in light of that. Mark, how do you conceptualise the present?
I've got a similar starting point, but I also use Bauman's sort of liquid modernity as well, but I also drawing things for the fact that my environment was highly casualized. So none of my, I have to say, meantime colleagues, because I started working in this sort of environment myself as an ethnographer, none of them had firm contracts. They all had casual contracts. And I used Polanyi to actually have a look into this commodification of labor as well, which is definitively outside the framework of modernity. But I think it is actually helpful to combine the two, like Zygmunt Bauman and Polanyi, in a sense that you can see mechanism going through the past a little bit longer than just modernity, than whatever modernity you want to tag on, is it liquid or whatever. So I like the fact that I can actually draw it a little bit further back into history. And I also see that the globalization fact that we are actually having globalized capital flows, and this is now Bauman again, globalization capital flows uprooting people. It's not, for the people I worked with, it's not actually too much of a choice. Well, they have always got a choice to actually be unemployed at home, but they are sort of really pushed out to do something about it. And some of them came over here with families. They left absolutely everything behind. They even closed the walls and made one room as a time capsule. By the time they come back, they will open this wall. It's actually a brick wall. So it's really, really a push factor. It's not really that they have got a choice, because
they don't want to necessarily be here in
really,
the beautiful sunny West.
Yeah, and they don't really want to not see their family as well, because in my work environment they were dispersed all over the place. And that has got influences how they keep contact with people at home, with their families, usually over the internet, how they use social media as well. It's a complete dispersal of everything. That's where I see an
So bringing Polanyi and Bauman together. Polanyi really is a great theorist of modernity, I think.
It is.
Bauman is pushing us beyond the traditional views of modernity. I think you're suggesting similar things. Continuity change. How do you sit with that?
So I kind of came to that, or maybe not a conclusion, but to this thought that some of these theorists are forgetting that there's still social structure. They're just these structures are just significant in different ways, new in different ways. They're constantly changing. But there is that continuity of social structure, say like, you know, you've got class, education, all these things structuring your life, but in different ways than maybe they were in the past.
Yeah. So that's where a notion of it's not quite as things used to be, so that's why people are trying to capture, thinking of Beck in particular, the idea of a late or a second modernity, as opposed to a post, something beyond modernity. There's a continuation taking place.
Yeah, I think especially the perception of loss of control is something which came up again and again and again within my research environment. And this loss of control, this acceleration, is something new from my perspective. This is something which wasn't really the case before. We could sort of have this artificial cult of modernity, I think.
Yeah, but which is often associated with the 1970s and the restructuring of the economies that started in the Western world then.
Yes, yeah.
You were going to say something else, Mark?
Go on. Okay.
I think we'll cut it there. I think that you've introduced some really interesting ideas for people to work with. And having made the point earlier that the term postmodernity tends to be reserved for discussions of the individual or of issues of identity and the cultural domain, where issues of fragmentation and dissonance, rejection of the grand narrative tend to be very much the norm in those conversations. we don't get to see that term postmodernity used so much in the political and economic arenas, which is what I think we've just been talking about to a degree. Although, Eleanor, you're not so driven by a focus on the flows of global capital in the way that Mark is. So you don't see the economic and the political term described very often in terms of being postmodern. Instead, we hear terms such as neoliberalism, late capitalism, post-Fordism, all of which pick up shifts away from the post-war commitments to the welfare state, the privatisation of public institutions that have taken place, the privatisation of the banks, telecommunications, hospitals, schools, and so on, as well as the loss of certainty that I think you're talking about there, associated with work. No more jobs for life. The constant refrain of flexibility in the workplace, the productivity focus, and that casualisation that's taken place in our time. And I think, again, this is evident in your work as well. Yeah, in the leisure industries as well. So the terms that are currently being embraced, that we're starting to discuss here, that help straddle the gaps between the individual cultural domains and the political economy spheres, is the sort of idea of a late modernity, a second modernity, as Beck calls it. And the terms used liberally in Suervo and Wynn's book that we'll start reading soon, parts of it at least. And it was evident in the paper on the sociological imagination and disability that you read last week. So the phrase is very current in sociology at the moment. So late and or second modernity helps shift the focus towards the continuities of the present. It moves us away from a focus on the discontinuities suggested by the post in postmodern. The old certainties, such as they were, job for life, spouse for life, clear division of labour in and around the house, may well be gone, but they haven't simply disappeared. We are not just simply fragmented and uncertain, and perhaps even despairing, as some commentators suggest. And I think Bauman does tend to lean towards the despair end of the spectrum. Yes. But that, I mean, sociology is punctuated by that, it seems to me. We've got those who see modernity as a problem and those who see it as a grand opportunity to be embraced. Eleanor's about to share a few insights about some key contributors to these discussions. And from there, I'm asking you to read some of the ideas about second modernity put forward by Ulrich Beck in These Risky Times, as he calls them. He also identified the contemporary world as one driven by concerns about risk. The risk society, as he's come to call it.